April 25, 1945. The Elbe River, Germany. The war in Europe is collapsing like rotten timber under the weight of a storm. Across the east, the Red Army surges forward with over 2.5 million men, a tidal wave of steel and vengeance. In their path, the remnants of the Wehrmacht, divisions that once strutted with confidence through Paris, Athens, and Kiev, are now reduced to gaunt, starving clusters of men hiding in barns, woods, and ruined villages. For every rifle still clutched in German hands, the Soviets have 3. For every shell they fire, the Soviets fire 20. In a farmhouse outside the village of Strela, Obergefreiter Karl Weiss pressed his ear to the ground and mistook the trembling rhythm for distant thunder. It wasn't thunder. It was the endless grinding of Soviet Katyusha rocket batteries, shrieking westward like banshees. The sound made men freeze, not just because of the destruction it promised, but because of what followed the explosions. Soviet infantry advancing with bayonets fixed, NKVD units behind them, and the chilling stories whispered among German ranks. Stories of men torn from hiding places, dragged eastward in endless columns, worked to death in mines or fields, or simply never seen again. German soldiers knew the statistics by rumor. Surrender to the Soviets meant a coin flip with death, perhaps worse than death. 1 out of 3 might survive captivity. The rest would vanish into nameless graves or the Gulag. But to the west, toward the Americans, there was still hope. Prison camps in France or Belgium, bread and cigarettes, a chance to live, a chance maybe to see home again. So as the front lines collapsed in spring 1945, a strange desperation gripped the Wehrmacht. It was no longer about holding ground or following orders. It was about direction. East meant annihilation. West meant survival. The battlefield had become a compass, and every German soldier who could still walk understood that their lives depended on which way their boots carried them. The chaos was total. Entire companies abandoned their officers. Columns of vehicles headed west under white bedsheets tied to sticks, colliding with others doing the same. And behind it all, the Soviets closed in. At dawn near Torgau, Weiss finally saw them, silhouettes on the horizon. He thought for a heartbeat they were American tanks. But then came the howl. The earth cracked open as rockets landed among the trees. The smell of cordite, the hammering of earth, the sensation of air itself being torn away. His men dove into the mud, clutching their helmets, some sobbing openly. When it stopped, when only the ringing in their ears remained, they lifted their heads and saw the river. The Elbe glistening under morning sun, and beyond it west, America. The realization spread like wildfire among them. The Soviets were behind, the Americans ahead. And between those two worlds lay a single river, swollen with spring floodwaters, its far bank invisible behind haze. For Karl Weiss and thousands like him, this was the final choice. Not about Hitler, not about the Reich, not about loyalty or courage. It was about survival and the will to gamble everything on reaching the West before the Soviets closed their trap. And so began one of the most desperate, chaotic migrations in modern war. An army no longer fighting to win, but racing to surrender. The Elbe shimmered like a border between worlds, and every German soldier who saw it felt the same thing. A lifeline, so close they could taste it. But the Soviets were not a storm that waited. They pressed forward with tanks, infantry, and artillery that pounded every bridge, every road, every open field. The Wehrmacht of 1945 was no longer the iron fist that had marched eastward 4 years earlier. It was a hollowed-out shadow, stitched together with boys of 17 and men in their 40s, hungry, exhausted, and led by officers whose orders now meant less than the rumors whispered by deserters. Go west or die. Karl Weiss saw this collapse unfold firsthand. The unit he marched with had been reduced to 70 men. Weeks earlier they had numbered more than 200. Some had fallen in skirmishes with Soviet advance patrols, others had simply slipped away at night. By April, the German army was not just retreating, it was unraveling. Soldiers threw away their helmets, their rifles, even their boots, staggering barefoot along the muddy roads, blending into columns of civilians who clogged every lane westward. Families with carts, oxen, bicycles, anything that could carry them, all moving under the constant drone of Soviet aircraft circling like hawks overhead. At dawn on April 26th, Weiss and his group reached a crossroads near the village of Strela. A sign pointed left toward Dresden, east, already half devoured by Soviet armies. The other pointed right toward Leipzig, where rumors said the Americans had broken through. The choice was obvious, but the road was jammed. Wehrmacht trucks with shattered windshields, horse-drawn wagons piled with children and furniture, wounded soldiers on crutches hobbling along the ditches, all surging west. The crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder, and the smell was unbearable: sweat, unwashed bodies, manure, smoke from distant burning villages. But worse than the smell was the panic. Every explosion in the distance sent the column into spasms. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Soldiers raised their rifles as if they could fend off artillery with bayonets. The fear was not abstract. It was sharpened by stories that circulated like wildfire. Men swore they had seen Soviet soldiers execute prisoners in ditches. Others spoke of women dragged from houses, of columns of captured Germans being forced back east, beaten as they marched. Nobody knew which stories were true. Nobody cared. The terror was enough to drive them faster. Weiss's commander, Lieutenant Fischer, still barked orders, but nobody listened. When he tried to hold the men in formation, they drifted into the civilian mass, disguising themselves with coats pulled over uniforms. By midday, even Fischer himself gave up. His voice broke. "Do what you must," he muttered, falling silent, walking like another refugee. The uniform on his back was now a death sentence, not a badge of command. The Elbe came into view again late in the afternoon. The Soviets were close now. The dull thunder of their artillery grew sharper, more precise, and in the woods across the river flashes lit the sky. Weiss's heart sank. East and west were colliding here, both armies racing for the same crossing. And the river, swollen with spring meltwater, offered no mercy. It was too wide to swim, too strong. At the edge of the village, a German engineer unit was already at work. They were laying pontoons across the river, desperate to create a bridge before Soviet shells found them. Soldiers and civilians crowded the banks, pushing, shouting, waving scraps of cloth at the Americans on the far side. And yes, Weiss saw them now. Olive-drab uniforms, stars on helmets. American soldiers standing on the western bank, rifles slung, watching the chaos unfold. It was the first time Weiss had seen an American up close. They didn't look like gods or monsters, just men. But they carried themselves differently, calmly, without fear. Some even leaned casually on their rifles, pointing toward the bridge, gesturing for the Germans to hurry. And in that moment, every German soldier on the East Bank felt the same surge of relief. Salvation was real. It stood across the river. Then the Soviets struck. The scream of Katyusha rockets tore the air apart, and the first salvo smashed into the water, throwing geysers of spray over the pontoons. A second salvo tore into the village itself. Roofs collapsed in fire, walls crumbled, people screamed and scattered. Horses reared, wagons overturned, the column dissolved into a stampede. Weiss grabbed the nearest child, someone's son, stumbling in the mud, and dragged him clear as splinters rained down like arrows. The boy's mother shrieked, pulling him back into her arms, and Weiss staggered toward what remained of the bridge. It was a slaughter. Men leapt into the river in panic, swept away by the current. Others clambered onto rafts, overloaded them, and capsized within minutes. Those who stayed on the bank were crushed by the crowd or cut down as more rockets screamed overhead. The Americans on the far side shouted, waving their arms, signaling desperately, but they could do nothing. The Elbe was not theirs to control. For Weiss, the memory burned into his mind was not the explosions or the blood in the water. It was the sound of thousands of voices crying out, not for the Führer, not for Germany, but for mercy, for a chance to live. By nightfall, the bridge was gone. The engineers had been obliterated, their pontoons reduced to drifting wreckage. The survivors huddled in ditches and barns, too terrified to sleep, listening to the Soviets pound the ground closer and closer. The choice that had seemed so clear in the morning, west or east, was now a nightmare. But even as the night deepened, new rumors spread like sparks in the darkness. There were still crossings further south, near Torgau. The Americans had linked up with Soviet patrols there, men said. If one could just reach them, if one could reach the line before the Soviets sealed it, surrender to the West was still possible. And so the march continued. Broken, bleeding, starving men and families dragged themselves onward, guided not by officers or orders but by whispers, by desperate hope. Each step was a gamble against time, against artillery, against the Red Army closing like a vice. Weiss staggered onward, clinging to that single thought. He had seen the Americans. They were real, and if he could only reach them, he might live. But the Soviets were not far behind, and every mile west was bought with blood. The night after the bridge at Strela was shattered, the air reeked of damp earth and burned wood. Smoke hung low, a choking haze that refused to clear even when the wind shifted. The village no longer existed, just ruins, a few walls blackened and swaying, the timbers still crackling under a blanket of ash. For the survivors there was no camp, no safe place, only ditches and ruined barns where they crouched in silence. Karl Weiss lay awake, mud pressed into his cheek, every muscle trembling though he felt no cold. His uniform clung to him like a second skin, crusted with sweat and filth. Around him the whispers never stopped. Some prayed, muttering the same words again and again. Others cursed Hitler, cursed the officers who had abandoned them, cursed the Soviets. The sharpest words came from men who had once shouted Sieg Heil with conviction. Now their loyalty had collapsed into something else entirely, naked desperation. He could not stop seeing the river, the men swept away, the horses thrashing as they drowned. The screams as rockets tore apart the bridge were still inside his skull, pounding louder than the artillery that now echoed faintly from the east. Every shell landed closer, a reminder that the Soviets were advancing step by step, kilometer by kilometer. By dawn, the decision was made, not by officers but by rumor. Word spread that further south, at Torgau, there were crossings still intact. Civilians and soldiers alike had made it through. Some even claimed to have seen Germans already surrendering directly to American units there, marched into captivity with cigarettes in their mouths and bread in their hands. It sounded like fantasy, but in this chaos, fantasy was enough. The column began to move again, slower now, limping, dragging carts with broken wheels, pulling children by the hand, but always west. The roads were no longer roads. They were rivers of humanity. Civilians streamed shoulder to shoulder, families pushing wheelbarrows, wagons creaking under impossible weight, oxen stumbling until they collapsed in the mud. Soldiers mingled in their midst, disguising themselves in peasant coats, hiding insignia beneath scarves. The fear of being recognized was real. Soviet patrols were rumored to shoot officers and SS men on sight. The longer the march, the more uniforms disappeared, stripped off, burned, or traded for rags. But the most dangerous men were not Soviets. They were Germans, the SS. Weiss saw them first outside a farmhouse near the road. A squad in black uniforms stood blocking the path, rifles across their chests, eyes hard. Their leader, a gaunt man with sunken cheeks and the rank tabs of an Untersturmführer, raised his hand. Civilians stopped, soldiers froze. A murmur swept the crowd. "Deserters," the officer spat, scanning the men. "Cowards, you will turn back, you will fight." Nobody moved. The crowd stood paralyzed, torn between hunger and terror. The officer stepped forward, yanked a boy by the arm, a German soldier no older than 17, face hollow, eyes bloodshot. The SS man dragged him to the roadside, pressed a pistol against his temple. "Discipline will be restored," he shouted, voice breaking with fanaticism. "The Führer has ordered that no one retreat. Those who abandon the Reich are traitors." Weiss felt his stomach twist. He had seen executions before, but now the boy's gaze darted frantically through the crowd, begging silently for someone to intervene. Nobody moved. The pistol fired. The boy crumpled into the mud, his blood dark against the road. The column gasped but did not resist. Fear did what bullets could not. It kept thousands in line. The SS moved among them, dragging more men from the crowd, checking for hidden uniforms, barking accusations. 2 more were shot on the spot. One tried to run, only to be cut down before he reached the ditch. That day the column learned the truth. Surrender was not just a race against the Soviets. It was a battle against their own. Fanatics clung to the Reich like drowning men to wreckage, forcing others to share their fate. To them, surrender was treason, and they would rather kill their comrades than let the dream of victory die. By the second night, Weiss had made his choice. He would not let SS men decide his fate. When darkness fell and the road grew quiet, he slipped away from the column with 2 others, Fischer, his weary lieutenant, and Otto, a baker's son from Hamburg who had joined the Wehrmacht the year before. They moved through fields, avoiding farmhouses, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches. The moon gave little light, and more than once Weiss stumbled into a ditch, clawing his way back out with hands raw from frost. But he preferred mud to the risk of being dragged out and executed for cowardice by men in black. Everywhere they went, the evidence of collapse surrounded them. Abandoned carts stood in the fields, horses dead in their harnesses. Villages were empty, shutters banging against walls in the wind. Once they passed a churchyard where civilians huddled under blankets, too weak to move. Children coughed weakly, their ribs visible through tattered clothes. Mothers' eyes stared blankly, devoid of hope. Nobody begged anymore. They were past that. The trio found shelter in a barn and shared what little they had. A crust of bread, a tin of lard, water scooped from a trough. Fischer whispered as he ate, as if the words themselves might bring Soviet patrols crashing through the door. "They're pushing faster now. I heard artillery near Meissen. We have days, maybe less." "Then we have to run faster," Otto muttered, licking his fingers. "I don't care if the Americans shoot me. Better than the Russians." Weiss nodded, though he said nothing. He could still see the Americans on the far bank of the Elbe, calm, steady, waving them onward. That image kept him moving even when his legs screamed for rest. But the road was not only filled with civilians and deserters. Twice they stumbled upon shattered Wehrmacht units, remnants of battalions that had been chewed apart in the east. These men were not running, they were rabid. Armed to the teeth, they roamed the road searching for stragglers, demanding loyalty at gunpoint. Some joined the columns, bullying civilians into feeding them. Others were simply feral, drunk on stolen schnapps, shooting into the air, shouting about vengeance. To fall into their path was as deadly as meeting a Soviet patrol. And always in the distance, the thunder of artillery grew louder. The Soviets were not chasing. They were crushing everything in their path, flattening resistance before it could form. The sound was constant now, a drumbeat of doom that drove the refugees onward like cattle. By April 27th, Weiss and his companions reached another river crossing south of Torgau. Here, too, chaos ruled. Thousands clogged the banks, waving white cloths toward the Americans on the far side. Soldiers in olive drab stood watching, just as they had days earlier, but this time they were closer. They shouted across, voices carrying faintly, "Wait there! Wait!" The crowd surged anyway. Improvised rafts groaned under the weight of families. Horses were driven into the water. Soldiers clung to planks. Some made it halfway before the current dragged them under. Others turned back, coughing, their eyes wide with despair. Then came the sound that froze every heart, the crackle of Soviet machine guns in the trees to the east. Shadows moved in the smoke and red tracers streaked across the sky. Panic erupted. Mothers shrieked for their children, men shoved others aside, the riverbank turned into a riot. Bodies pressed so tightly Weiss could barely breathe. He clutched Otto's arm, dragging him back into the crowd. Fischer was nowhere to be seen. Gunfire ripped through the mob and people fell screaming into the mud. Weiss staggered, forced backward by the human tide, the riverbank dissolving into chaos. Somewhere behind him, a Soviet voice bellowed, sharp and commanding. And Weiss realized with sudden clarity they were out of time. The Soviets had arrived. The convoy stretched into the horizon like a broken artery leaking its lifeblood across the countryside. Wagons creaked, their wheels wrapped with cloth to muffle the sound, and men stumbled forward in silence, too exhausted to speak. From the air, if one of the American spotter planes had been circling, the column would have looked like a snake shedding its skin. 1,000 fragments of gray, disjointed, sloughing away from the Reich's corpse. And yet for those trapped inside it, every mile toward the Elbe was an act of will, a decision not yet to collapse, not yet to give in to the Russians, shadow pressing on their heels. The men no longer marched in proper columns. They drifted. Helmets dangled from belts, rifles were slung not as weapons but as burdens, and more than one officer had ceased trying to keep ranks. Their boots slapped against mud that clung to their ankles like shackles. Somewhere to the east, the dull boom of artillery rolled like thunder across the sky. It was distant, muffled, but to the veterans it was enough to bring a chill up the spine. They knew the Soviets were still moving, still devouring ground by the hour. Every day the Red Army surged westward, and every day German divisions evaporated under its advance. Lieutenant Müller wiped mud from his brow and glanced toward the men trudging ahead of him. He counted at least 30 from his company, gaunt, eyes hollow, most without ammunition. A few carried loaves of stolen bread wrapped in cloth. One had tied a cowbell to his pack, a remnant from some abandoned farm. He could barely recognize them as soldiers anymore. They looked more like vagrants fleeing a catastrophe. But to Müller, they were still his responsibility. "Keep moving," he whispered hoarsely, though his voice carried little authority.